Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your hosts, Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson.
Hi, Peter Carter here with Dr. Donaldson for an episode on how sacred art can and has been used for evangelization. Our guest today is Dr. Elizabeth Lev, a renowned art historian, author, and speaker who lives in Rome and makes the Church's treasures of art come alive and be understood by modern audiences. Her most recent book is titled How Catholic Art Saved the Faith, The Triumph of Beauty and Truth in Counter-Reformation Art, which is very fascinating, by the way. When I was reading it, I realized that her insight into art and evangelization is exactly the kind of perspective that we needed on this show, especially as another lens through which to see sacred music. There are so many intersections between sacred art, architecture, and music, so I'm really excited to hear what she has to share with us today.
Thanks so much for being with us today, Dr. Lev.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
We're going to talk a bit today about beauty, art, evangelization, but to start off, could you talk about the idea that beauty can be a subtle and disarming means of persuasion, and when used in service to truth, it can lead people to good rather than evil and virtue rather than sin?
I think it's something that we see a lot every day in Rome, right? You are in a position to have a city that's basically an open-air museum. You have exceptional work after exceptional work. And every day people file in and they're of different political convictions. They're from different existential beliefs. They're different people who could indeed actually easily begin to argue or fight if they were simply discussing something together. But they turn towards this one thing, and there's something they can agree on. It's beautiful. It's something we all want to look at. It's something that uplifts us. So I think art really does have a tremendous capacity of bringing people together and focusing them on something that is better or even higher than oneself.
You describe in your book how the Church responded to the Protestant Reformation by teaching Catholic theology and evangelization through art and beauty. I know I was particularly amused when you described the artists as spearheading the public relations campaign for the Church. And it's really true in a way, since the art that they made began to be associated with the Church, the connotation people would think of when they think of the Catholic Church. Could you give an example or two of how a theme of art or a specific work of religious art helped to make attractive an aspect of theology?
You know, I realize it can seem kind of funny to be talking about PR campaigns and things that sound very, secular and corporate when we talk about the Catholic Church. But, at the end of the day, people respond to what they respond to, and they need to be drawn to something. They need to be, in a certain sense, jollied along. And so if we can cast our minds back to imagine a period, the 16th century, where there is a form of communication that has suddenly burst on the scene. You have this printing press. And so you have document upon document, pamphlet upon pamphlet, which is being circulated all over Europe. And people get these pieces of paper in their hands. 150 million of them by 1550 a year are being produced. And so on one hand, the Protestants master this medium. They come up with catchy titles. I mean, stuff that really sounds a lot like what we would call clickbait, an exciting headline on the origin of the papacy, instituted by the devil. I mean, who's not going to pick that up and read it? It's got a real, wow, I wonder what he's talking about. And so the Church isn't really going to win on that score. They're not going to, and we hope the Church is not going to produce a whole bunch of catchy little pamphlets that are superficial and don't really have any grounding in theology. On the other hand, when poor Robert Bellarmine actually tries to refute the Protestants line by line, he shows up with this tome that no sane person is really going to read unless they're looking for a PhD. So what have we got? we have to find another way to communicate. And art becomes one of the most, it's something the church already knows how to do. The Protestants know how to write a clever headline. The Catholics know how to produce a work of art. And so the church gets behind artists, helps artists, doesn't just leave them alone to try to figure out how to catch your attention. It forms the artists. And so you have people like Caravaggio, men like Annibale Carracci, who's a very important artist in this period, producing works of art that help us to understand the sacraments better, help us to understand the importance of intercession, why saints matter to us, and to help us understand, how we live out our faith in, the contemporary world of the 16th century.
So, in terms of evangelization, it seems that for art to be effective, it has to have some elements which are immediately captivating to the untrained or uninitiated, presenting something that's somehow easy to understand at first sight. But at the same time, it also has to maintain the highest standards of artistic excellence so that the art wouldn't compromise the truths it's trying to communicate by being cheap or shoddy, as you were just explaining. So, in other words, it has to have a beauty and a depth that bear repetition well, bear contemplation well. Could you explain how, for example, the style of painting immediately following the Council of Trent was particularly good at balancing these two aspects of immediacy and depth?
Yes, so the art kind of falls between two different poles. There are moments when art gravitates more towards the linear, which is a very kind of intellectually, carefully, boundary-oriented, contour-oriented type of visual experience, and moments when it veers towards color, sort of a much more visceral, you see a pretty color and it catches your eye. And this is where the effective music begins to align with art. The Catholic Church had already dealt with the question of music long before it dealt with art, and it was in 1555 when the Catholic Church already decided that music was a very, very potent way of uplifting and drawing the faithful back to the church, because music acts on the spirit. It lifts you up. Half the time your mind doesn't even understand what's happening. You just have this music that works on the spirit. Color has a very similar effect. So the first great artists to come out of the gates, as it were, are going to be great colorists. And we have artists like a man named Barocci, who I mention a lot in How Catholic Art Saved the Faith, because he's an artist I love very, very much. He uses color. It's like the color of flame, these splashes of yellows and oranges and red. And so sometimes it looks like like you're looking into a fireplace on a dark evening. And then every now and then, when he wants you to focus closely on something, it's like watching. I mean, this is a painting in 1600 that looks like it's using the high definition camera on a modern day machine. Suddenly, everything tightens and becomes very, very clear. So your eye is captured by the color, and then he draws you in afterwards with his very careful and constructed line.
So a lot of this painting is obviously realistic in style. Would you say that there are certain artistic styles, such as something that's really abstract, that wouldn't likely be as effective in evangelization since they're less likely to be able to easily communicate theological truths? Are there some particular styles that you think are particularly less effective in this regard?
Now, insofar as contemporary art is concerned, I know there are very, very prestigious and important art historians who deal with sacred art who would disagree with me and believe that in our day and age, a more abstracted form, a less representational or figurative form of art is admissible and somehow helpful in art. I am going to stick to the turf I know, and in the 16th century, they are dealing with a problem of iconoclasm. So among the myriad problems that the Reformation brings is a rejection of art. And so in northern parts, certain pockets of the Reformation countries are actually destroying art as idolatry, really demanding that the church no longer produce art. Art is fundamentally, when the church has to respond to this type of problem, it goes back to the reason why we make art to begin with. It is incarnational. It is there to remind us that God in heaven, God great in unimaginable, this greatness of God became first a child, something that we could even pick up and hold. It was a man, was something that the human experience could see and truly experience. So people touched Jesus. Jesus touched people, and they saw him, they heard him. He was a completely sensory experience. And art is a way of recalling that. Art is a way of remembering that, evoking that. So in the 16th, 17th century, art must be representational. It must be clear to understand. It must represent the material, the world that we live in, and then point to the greatness, to point to the divine beyond.
I love the phrase you used in your book, art for faith's sake. I hadn't heard it before. I think many artists and musicians today experience so much in their training that art is for art's sake and beauty is for beauty's sake, which is a deceptive message because beauty is not an end to itself. By using art for evangelization, art is not independent, but at the service of the truths of the faith. Can you talk to this relation and at times perhaps strong tension between beauty and truth in religious art? I know in music, for example, that some composers might leave out certain parts of liturgical texts in their composition if that part of the text didn't fit well with their overall idea of the piece. What would be an equivalent to that in religious art?
There was a very serious conflict regarding art in the 16th century. And as a matter of fact, the final session of the Council of Trent had to address the problem of religious art. And the problem came into being because after the golden age of Michelangelo and Raphael and Leonardo da Vinci, artists who were kind of trailing in the very frothy wake of these great geniuses started working out concepts of art where they would take an idea or a motif from one of the great masters and elaborate it just to kind of play with the idea. So it became an art that was more for the demonstration of the skill and the ingenuity and the creativity of the artist rather than the service of the message of the truth of the art itself. As a matter of fact, the most dangerous accusation that ever was laid at Michelangelo's door in art history, and it was not the nudity or the pornography or the this or that. The real danger, the most insidious accusation was when someone said he preferred his art to his subject. And that is when Michelangelo actually found it very, very difficult to navigate. And that's eventually what will cause the covering of the nude figures in the Sistine Chapel's Last Judgment. So there is that. Art for art's sake, qua that concept, is a notion that comes from the Romantic era, and it snowballs during the course of the 19th century. So remember that the end of the 18th century sees this great age of the revolutions, the liberté, égalité, fraternité, and so this idea of liberté, everything should be free, artists should be free. And that snowballed all the way through the 19th century. It brought us through the Impressionists, through Picasso. It brings us into the age that we're in today, where art is supposed to be free. And yet, ironically, art seems to be more shackled than before because the artist in his or her freedom has gone down roads where nobody's really interested anymore. So the visual arts have lost all kind of prestige. In the meantime, you see the tremendous lines that snake around the block for the Sistine Chapel, Leonardo da Vinci's Salvator Mundi, which goes for $140 million. You see the art that is deeply configured to meaning, to truth, to a significance which is universal and eternal. That art never seems to get old. The biggest show in Rome in the past 10 years was the Caravaggio show with 24 uncontested Caravaggios. That's all. 24 Caravaggio paintings in a series of rooms sold out around the corner. It's and even the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which did a show just on objects that are meant to evoke the divine from the Vatican. There is something about the way that artists use beauty in the service of truth that makes the work last. And you know this full well from music. I mean, your pop songs, they switch out every couple of weeks. They're just, there's something that's they're like junk food. You eat them and you dispose of them. But a really beautiful piece of constructed music meant to evoke a higher power, notion, state, ideal. Those are pieces of music that even little kids know and hum because they're just part of our collective imagination.
Could you speak a little bit about the correlation between masterpieces of religious art and times of crisis in the church? For example, when we think of music, we might think of the work of the English composer William Byrd, who composed some of the most amazing works of choral music in the Catholic repertoire, and in a time of intense religious persecution. Is it that persecution brings out the best in artists, or is it that tranquility in the life of the church is more effective in cultivating excellent sacred art?
I think it's attention. I think what we're looking for is attention, care, collaboration, and the desire to find something beautiful in the midst of what is ugliness, chaos, confusion, and dissonance. So in one hand, you might have beautiful things that come out of an era of active persecution where the poor Catholic Christian person cannot lift his or her head out of this state of oppression and makes something beautiful to try to, even though maybe can't physically break through the social, legal, societal barrier, points towards something greater. But in the case of the 16th century, what we have is an era of profound crisis, tremendous ugliness on the part of the revelation in the 16th century, of ignorance of the clergy, of misbehavior on the part of the clergy. I mean, the clergy does not look great in the 16th century. Every 5 minutes, someone's holding up Alexander VI Borgia and his various antics. So the clergy isn't looking good. We have ugliness in the clergy. We have ugliness among Christians who are fighting among themselves in direct conflict of they will Christian. You will know they are Christians by the way they love one another. So you have ugliness everywhere, and the church really harnesses the thing it has always had. It understood in the era of real persecution under the Roman Empire. It is understood in periods of internal persecution, when terrible heresies start to come to the fore, that sometimes it's best to point outwards towards the ideal, towards something beautiful, and they collaborate. They collaborate, prelates and artists. The prelates do not condescend to the artists. They form them. They make them almost equals. Artists do not claim that their creativity is stifled if they have to conform to this, to certain rules. They understand that having a playing field allows them to express their creativity, not horizontally, not laterally, but since they have boundaries in a field they have to play with, their creativity goes upwards, as if you will, towards the heavens. So these are kind of the factors that produce the art of the 16th, 17th century that really does reinforce and make us reaffirm our belief in the ancient truths of the faith.
So a related question to that is the idea of patronage. You're talking about, especially in your book, the interaction between theologians and the artists. And so if we think of kind of two aspects of patronage, one is that the church would have to have the money to pay artists, and the other is that you have to have an educated clergy and educated theologians, not only in theology, but they have to understand the sort of artistic media and the grammar of artistic expression. And what would you say in terms of what you know of from the 17th century, for example, or late 16th century, that in terms of the training of clergy that helped facilitate good interactions between artists and clergy that could maybe be applicable to something that might help us understand how to better facilitate that interaction in today's times?
I think it's not so much that we had a particular, I mean, it's not always a question of a particularly educated clergy, although some were, but some of those very artistically educated clergy, on the surface of it, appeared to be part of the problem. We have Cardinal Alexander Farnese, who single-handedly paid for the Jesuit Church of the Gesù in Rome. It's probably the greatest architectural turning point in the Catholic Restoration, when the Catholics build a church that is purposely designed for sacraments. Alexander Farnese, his particular talent, believe it or not, was self-promotion. He was an extraordinarily good self-promoter for his family, rich as can possibly be, and really good at saying, well, if you want to get noticed, do this. And so this amazing collaboration between the Jesuits, who kept saying, no, tone it down. No, we're trying to be austere. No, we're trying to be, have you heard of poverty? They keep trying to tone it down. Alexander keeps saying, no, you got to get people to go, wow. And between the two of them, they created a church which on one hand really makes you go wow, but it makes you go wow for the greater glory of God. And it's an amazing collaboration. So in this case, we have a man who knows a lot about art, but not exactly, if you were to look at it on paper, you would say, oh no, we don't want that guy to be involved in this church. On the other hand, you have another cardinal who's a saint, St. Charles Borromeo, who is so interested that he gets involved in writing treatises for building churches. So you have really a gamut. I think what one requires really is this spirit of collaboration and an eye to understanding that what we are doing for the greater glory of God. And so it's a little the ability to listen to one another, the ability to collaborate. But in the case of these two churches, the focus of both churches was always uncompromisingly on the presence of God of Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament, in the tabernacle, on the altar, and that was the focus of the church. So that's kind of where there's not a grid, but there's a sense of a grid of how to make prelates and artists work together. But there is a sense of fruitful collaboration. If both go into that with that spirit, that something beautiful can come of it.
So this is a topic perhaps that plays into your understanding both of patronage, like we were just discussing, as well as your love of the city of Rome. In the modern time, if people want to criticize the church, sometimes they do it at the expense of the church's artistic beauty. They'll say, look at all these things that the church owns in Rome and in the Vatican, and that money could be spent more adequately on service to the poor. What would you say to someone to help them see that the church's preference for the poor and love of the poor is not inimical to something like being a patron of excellent art?
Well, I think there's a very clear message already in Scripture where we talk about, yes, there are the poor who don't have enough to eat, who are homeless, who are ill, who need material assistance. But there's also the poverty of spirit. And the poverty of spirit afflicts many, 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 many people. You think of all the people who are, clambering off the cruise ships and wandering their way into the city and milling around looking for, gelato or whatever it is that they have in order to kind of pass this time. Many of those people they go to Italy because it's a place to go to. They are wandering around from place to place because you have to check something off a list to tell your neighbors. Inside, these people, we don't know what they experience, but even though they're affluent enough to get on a cruise ship, well, they'll never go hungry. They sleep in a comfortable bed. There is something that is fundamentally lacking, and so they're searching for. And that beauty placed out there for people to feast upon, literally to feast upon. Rome is like a giant feast of beauty. And one of those morsels in one church, in one piazza, in one collection, one of those morsels has the possibility of maybe feeding the spirit, opening the eyes, and drawing these people to something with which they will never go hungry. And so beauty we're very cynical about beauty today. We're very, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. People don't believe in beauty. People think, oh, we don't need beauty. I've been looking at people reacting to how Catholic art saves the faith. And they say, oh, we don't need beauty. We need doctrine. We don't need beauty. We need to feed the poor. Beauty is something that helps to nourish us and remind us that we may be hungry. We may be hungry physically, we may be hungry in spirit, but it reminds us that there is something that is ideal, that is greater, that we work for, we strive to. It gives us hope. And as we know, hope saves.
For our last question, I'd like to set all these ideas in the present circumstances of today in the context of the current confusion and crises facing the church. Many in the church may feel powerless and not know how they can help change things for the better. What would be your advice to artists and musicians today who love their craft and want to use it for the glory of God and the Catholic faith?
The reason why I ended up writing this book is because of the number of similarities I noted between the period that I've studied, which is the period post-Restoration and Reformation, and our present period. And in particular, as you noted, confusion is rife. We clearly have a lot of confusion about the sacraments, all of them. We have confusion. We don't understand what it means to be married, what it means to be truly to need absolution. We don't understand what it means to have God present on the altar. So we are in a state of, in many ways, I think, even more confusion than in the 16th century. On top of that, the confusion is very polemical. There is a sort of a constant tension between just even within the Catholic circle. And so I think we find ourselves in very, very similar situations. I wish I could tell you there was a Caravaggio waiting in the wings and a Cardinal Gabriele Paliotti waiting to instruct a new bunch of artists to create works to lead us out of that confusion. I don't think it's going to be painting, sculpture, and architecture to the rescue this time round. I do think there's a lot of potential for music to be helpful, music that uplifts, music that brings together many, even in our concept of globalization and diversity, music that brings together many different sounds and instruments to create one sort of awesome whole, not a music that's supposed to just ape the worldly pop music that we are always kind of consuming just to pass the time and to have in the background. And I also think things like film and television have great potential to sway and move us, because this is something that people consume, and they'll consume any message through television. They'll watch any pretext. I can't fully understand why we haven't produced a work that really helps people consume a good message, an uplifting message of truth in the Catholic faith.
This has been so helpful and so enlightening, Dr. Love. We really appreciate you being with us, and we'll have more information on our show notes page about your book so that people can read further about the ideas that you put forth there, and also appreciate how you're able to draw in the person looking at these works of art into an understanding not only of the beauty of the art, but of the theological realities it conveys. It's a very fine book. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a delight talking to both of you.
Yeah, thank you again. It's been an honor to have you. Wow, I really enjoyed what she had to say. I especially like how, amid all the different questions that we talked about today, one thing that struck me was the importance of art and how it is used. And no matter how the art is used, whether in a building, painting, or in music, it has an effect on people, and in a particular way, I think, on the artist who created it. And that's especially important, I think, in sacred music, as singers are the ones creating the music, which becomes their act of prayer. It also gives hope and purpose, I think, to artists that their craft is important and useful and can be a part of transforming themselves and others and bringing them closer to Christ.
If you're looking to learn more before our next episode, check out upcoming events on our website. Included on the list, you'll find our upcoming sacred music course offerings at St. Joseph's Seminary in Yonkers, New York. This summer, we'll offer 4 courses: Teaching Gregorian Chant to Children, Principles of Sacred Music, Principles of Chant, and Introduction to the Organ for Pianists. More information is also available on dunwoodie.edu. That's DUNWOODIE.edu. Another big event this summer is the Church Music Association of America's Sacred Music Colloquium. It's a week of beautiful liturgies, chant and polyphony rehearsals, interesting lectures, and great fellowship. Find out more and register for the colloquium at musicasacra.com.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory's Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole, from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is the first movement of Trio Sonata No. 6 in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Peter Carter. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.